Hey folks, Mark Scroggins with another episode of Family Law Talk. And today we have a very special guest, Cindy Hyde.
Thank you, Mark.
How are you?
Glad to be here.
Good. So Cindy is an expert in the world of sex and love addiction as well as other areas, but that is how I got to know Cindy, because it is, this seems to be, I don't necessarily want to call it a newer area, but let's say that it is becoming more newly recognized. Would that be accurate?
Mm-hmm. That is accurate.
Okay.
Yes.
So can you tell people a little bit about your background and how you got into this and then the education surrounding it?
Yeah, I'd be glad to. And again, my name is Cindy Hyde, and I am a licensed professional counselor, and I specialize in complex trauma as well as sex addiction, love addiction, codependency, narcissistic abuse, or what I like to call invisible abuse. So it's anything that doesn't leave a bruise. And
I love that term, by the way.
Mm-hmm. Isn't that great? And so, yeah, I just started seeing clients. A lot of times clients will come in to see me and they'll say, my husband or my wife in that case can't stop cheating, and I don't understand what's going on, and we're about to get a divorce, and we just can't figure out the problem. And a lot of times the person that may be acting out sexually is in denial about their sexual behaviors, and they can feel like that it's just an impulsive behavior, or it's not really out of control. And so a lot of times it turns out it is actually a sex addiction.
Right.
And so there's certain assessments that certified sex addiction therapists can assess in order to determine if it is or in fact not a sex addiction.
So let's talk about that a little bit, because one of the things we were talking about before we started the podcast was I have found that over, God, I hate to say this out loud, but it's coming up on 30 years that I have been doing this now, 29 in May. So holy crap, I guess that officially means I'm freaking old. Okay, so
I'm there with you.
So I might need to talk to you after the show to try to deal with some of that shit.
Right.
But it seems like people get a new psychological buzzword, okay?
Yes, correct.
And so narcissism is, I'm going to say the WebMD term of the month or so far of 2022, because I meet with a lot of people that come in and they start speaking LPC or psychologist or whatever, and they have an abnormal use of psychological terminologies that some may or may not actually know what the hell they're talking about.
Right.
But another one that has started coming up is the sex and love addiction. And it seems like it used to be a couple of different things. Used to be seen as something that only was a male affliction, and that does not seem to be true.
That is not correct.
Okay. And then also it, being in that addiction world, it also seems to one that it's got a ton of shame attached to it. And so because of that, I think it is viewed by certain folks as a lack of morality or an inability to control one's base instincts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that gets misinterpreted a lot, actually. Right. A lot of times with men in particular, and you're absolutely right, it afflicts women as well, and it's getting to be almost as high of number. And I think a lot of the social media and the dating apps and a lot of what's available in our world today contributes to that. But I'll use the example of children, and so little boys, when they're young, when they get exposed to pornography, for example, it could start getting out of control as a young child if they go undetected in what they're doing online.
Okay.
And so what it can then happen is it grows and it becomes more and more addictive.
Right.
Because it actually puts them into this fantasy world. that they're, and so they're learning how to self-soothe
Right.
with pornography. Just like if they started drinking at a young age, it's, they learn that, oh, this feels good, this makes me feel better,
Right.
and then it keeps growing and growing and growing. Well, then fast forward, and they're a 40-year-old male, and that 40-year-old male can no longer control the acting out behavior. So then it may escalate into other things that they never would have considered before. They may be watching types of porn that they never watched previously or would have even considered, and goes completely against their value system. Or they may even change genders in their acting out behavior when they don't even identify as someone in the LGBT community.
Right.
And so it really can escalate and go unchecked, and it can really start taking over their lives. It can drain their finances, just like any other addiction could. And so, typically what Patrick Carnes says, and he's the really the expert in the field that really kind of discovered this type of addiction. He basically says that if it lines up with any other addictive pattern, like if you were, for instance, using drugs and it became an addiction,
Right.
and you could not stop that addiction for a period of 6 months,
Right.
well, then you obviously are addicted if you can't stop on your own and stay stopped for 6 months. That's the same criteria they apply to sex addiction. And so that's why, it is an addictive behavior, and it ruins a lot of people's lives.
Let me ask a question, because I was noticing, I was reading an article recently that was talking about the level of, not the level of addiction, the percentage of people that have a sex or love addiction in the U.S. And then I think this study also had some within the U.K. And I noticed the U.K. percentages were slightly less than in the U.S. And I'm wondering if there is other research that you are aware of out there that is tied to a higher level of addiction in those societies that seem to be more repressed sexually, and wondering if that is a connection. Because, I mean, just the difference in Western society, between the U.S. and Europe in general, much more discussion related to sex and sex on TV, less violence over there.
Right.
As compared to here. You can blow the shit out of anything that you want, but you can't make, certain sexually charged comments, which, make it, I start thinking about anything you make taboo increases the desire for people to attain it.
Absolutely.
So,
Absolutely. And that's, we see that in the drug world.
right.
That is, when it's illegal, there's definitely a rebellious factor that comes into play that, people want what they can't have.
Right.
Right. And
Right.
so, in the European countries, they tend to be, so much more lax in their sexuality.
Right.
They have so many more nude beaches and things that
Right.
we don't have in the United States. So I think certainly that could play into, the environment in which you were raised, the culture in which you were raised, and what those, what you were taught about sex.
Right.
I work with a lot of people, in the complex trauma part of my job, in their family of origin. And so many that had, that parents didn't talk about sex or didn't explain what healthy sexuality was, they most definitely grew up, and it became, and I see this a lot with the men that I work with, where they started watching porn really young because they were just so curious.
Right. That's all, it's just all interesting to me, because I think, I grew up in the Episcopal Church, and it was great until it wasn't for me. And then, I consider myself to be very, very spiritual, but I don't do well with organized religion. I am not mature enough in my spirituality to be able to take what works for me and leave the rest.
Right.
I haven't gotten to that point where I can do that.
Right.
Maybe someday, but it seems because of, those religious overtones that it's almost, I'll take out the word almost. It's taught that sex is almost a bad thing.
Correct.
or it's dirty, it's the prurient interests. And from a biological standpoint, that just seems like absolute crap, So, so if somebody starts thinking that they have an issue, so one of the things that you mentioned that I found very interesting is when people start acting out based on the addiction, it can even go against what their normal gender preferences are.
Yes, and their core value system.
Okay.
There's so many types of pornography out there. It's really astronomical how many different types. And one of the things that I do when I'm working with someone that either feels like they have an addiction or I feel like they could, I will give them some assessments, and it asks some pretty deep questions on, what types of things they're viewing, what their rituals are before they act out sexually, to help kind of hone in on, where this all started for them, what it is, why they're going beyond their actual value system.
Right.
And you're absolutely right. They can actually switch genders when they don't identify as being either lesbian or homosexual. They actually may start pursuing an opposite sex gender just simply because it's the escalation in the disease.
That's so interesting. So, because you and I have talked a little bit about that before, and I was having a hard time understanding that piece. I understand it if you identify as bisexual or pansexual, or, and I'm not going to go beyond those two statements because then I'm not really going to understand what the hell I'm talking about. But if you identify that way, I can understand the fluidity of gender selection, right? But if you really identify as heterosexual, truly identify that way, that just seems like that's a hard one for me to grasp from an acting out standpoint.
Correct. And so on the assessments, it specifically asks a question on a scale of 1 to 7.
Right.
1, do you identify as gay or homosexual, or do you identify as straight up heterosexual as a 7?
Right.
And I see it over and over again, and whether it's men or women,
right.
They'll put heterosexual, but yet the porn sites they are looking at also include men, or their acting out behavior has included men. And so, and even asking them straight out, does that mean that you're bisexual? No, I'm definitely not that. Are you sure? Maybe it's just you haven't come out yet. No, I'm definitely not that. It was just an experimentation. And a lot of them will say that sometimes, yeah.
And do they continue to make that comment about the experimentation even when it's been more than once or twice? We're not talking about something like somebody tried something once and goes, oh, yeah, no, not a fan.
Yes, no, they will. And, where I see too, and you deal with a lot of family law, you know, it's really hard for the spouses to comprehend, and I've seen this happen with women too, where they're acting out with other women, but yet they highly identify as heterosexual and not bi. And so even when given a really safe space to say, yes, I'm bi or I'm gay, or they still will maintain that that's not who they are. And so typically, the assessment is then it must be an escalation of the disease itself. And because it's just like when you think about, like, if somebody was using heroin, okay, they can't use the same amount of heroin every time. It will have to be more. You
have to increase the dosage,
and more and more, because the high has to get better to sustain them, right? And so it's the same thing. It's just increasing the high because people that are operating in sex addiction are getting high. It's filling their body full of chemicals that make them high, and that's what causes the release and the self-soothing for them. just like a heroin addict would use heroin for that reason.
Gotcha. Okay, well, I want to come back and visit on some of that. So, folks, stay tuned. We're going to continue down this road for a little while. Cindy, thank you for being here and helping me to learn more about
Thank you,
this.
Mark.
All right, folks, we'll be back.